Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, Young Adult Librarian Extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
We're here to continue our exploration of Native American mythology. We're trying to travel across country, starting on the East Coast and moving across the country, but it doesn't always work out that way when you're dealing with the world of myth, because myths are not defined by geography. So before we go on, though, I want to correct something from last week, or actually have an addition to what we discussed last week. Remember the story of how Muskrat pulled up the mud that was used to coat the turtle that became the entire world? All right? And I said at the time I didn't understand why Muskrat was given all that enormous responsibility. Okay, so as soon as I got home, my wife, who had done more research than me, immediately explained why a muskrat was able to create the earth like that. Okay, first of all, muskrats like to eat crustaceans that live in the mud at the bottom of fresh water. So they dive down and come up from the bottom holding muddy clumps in their hand all the time. So you can't hang around muskrats and not see them do that. And also, they use the mud to make their own little dens and warrens, which they then coat with grass. And so if they do this during high tide, or when the water is high, then when the water recedes again, they leave these mounds behind that look a lot like a turtle shell.
Very cool.
So it all fits together like that. Plus, muskrats like to have running water, whereas beavers will build dams to stop the water from flowing. Muskrats will grab grass from around the estuaries and things where they live in the wetlands and use that to plaster the walls of the little dens. And so that keeps the water flowing freely.
Okay.
So it's very useful to have muskrats around. And so of course they're the perfect animal to bring up enough mud to create the earth out of.
That works.
So that's one problem solved. All right, so moving on, we're talking about the Plains Indians today.
Okay.
I'm concentrating on the Sioux, which is right away a huge ethnic group. The Sioux consist of many tribes. There are 7 main tribes and 13 more that are considered sort of under their purview, so to speak. Most tribes are broken up by language, but the Sioux consist of at least 3 completely different languages. But the Sioux include the Lakota, the Oglala, the Teton, and the Hunkpapa, and several others.
Okay, and is this in the western part of?
They're basically in the Midwest on the plains. These are the Plains Indians. They have a lot of cool mythology surrounding them. Some of it is quite famous. I want to start with basically the origin of their people. It's not exactly a creation myth, but it bears a lot of semblance to other creation myths. So apparently, at one point, the earth was flooded. You've encountered several other creation myths before involving floods. It happens in virtually every mythology all around the world. Several different Native American groups have completely different flood myths, but almost all of them have something about floods. Particularly on the plains, if there's too much water, there's no place for the water to go. There aren't a lot of natural rivers and lakes for the water to flow into. So when water starts moving across the plains, you can be in trouble very fast. So what happened was there were people populating the Great Plains, and the world flooded. They couldn't escape it. The water was rising too fast, and so most of them were wiped out. And they drowned, and they sank to the bottom of the water, where their flesh and their bones became a red stone, which will pop up later. That'll be important. So meanwhile, there was one survivor, one lone woman, who fortunately was a very beautiful woman, as often happens in these stories. She was trying to climb to the highest tree and to escape the water when a huge eagle flew by and saw her and decided to help her. So she jumped up and grabbed a hold of the eagle's talons, and he flew her around and around to a place where he had his nest. It was a long tower that was so high it couldn't be flooded. Some say it's what we call Devil's Tower today. So she's up there with the eagle, and she's very grateful for he saved her life. And so the two of them wind up falling in love and get married. People and animals are much closer in those days, so she was able to marry this eagle, and they had children together.
I think that explains something from Rick and Morty.
Well, I don't watch Rick and Morty, so I have no idea. This does explain why technically all the Sioux consider themselves to have eagle's blood.
Ah. Okay.
So yes, so when the water receded, their children and grandchildren went out to populate the world, as one does in these sort of myths. However, times were tough for them. It took a long time for food to grow. They were wandering across the grassy plains. There was nothing to eat. And so for a while, things are extremely difficult for them. But one time, 2 scouts were out, like hunting around to find something. And they got to the top of a hill and they looked down and they saw, unexpectedly, an extremely beautiful woman coming towards them. As she approached them, they were both overwhelmed by her beauty. One of the hunters instantly dropped to his knees. He recognized right away that she was something special. But the other guy, though, thought that she was so beautiful he had to have her. So he ran up and grabbed a hold of her, and as soon as he touched her, they were surrounded by a cloud of mist. And when the mist floated away, the woman was still standing there, but the guy was left a pile of bones lying on the plains. So fortunately, the one who knelt and greeted her properly knew right away that she was Wakan, or sacred, that she should not be touched. And the woman said to them, "Go tell your people to prepare for me." And so he went racing back to his people and said, "Look, she's coming, she's a goddess." So they gathered together all of their supplies and things like that, and they had nothing to make a feast. They couldn't give her any food. All they really had was water. But still, they had enough materials to build a great medicine lodge to get ready for her. So she arrives, and she reaches into this pouch that she has, and she pulls out something they'd never seen before, which was a pipe. And the pipe was made from red stone. And this is what they call the peace pipe. This is a very famous Native American thing. It's something that's sacred to them. When you smoke the pipe, the smoke goes up to the heavens and carries your prayers to the Great Spirit. So you should smoke the peace pipe when you're having ceremonies, when you're signing peace treaties, things like that. Any sacred time you use the pipe. She taught them the proper prayers to the earth, which was their mother, and the sky, which was their father. It's one of these sky-earth things that we often see in different mythologies. She also taught them a lot of other things. There was a puberty ritual. There's apparently a ball game that kids could play. And also, she left some other things behind that were sealed and could only be opened by her when she came back to them again. So that's the myth of the eternal return. So some people are waiting for a white buffalo woman to come back again. And not too long ago, when a white buffalo calf was born, it excited a lot of people, believing that it was a powerful mystical sign. Although the animal's fur later turned brown anyway, but it was still very, very cool while it lasted. But that's an example of how prominent this myth is, that when the white buffalo calf was born, thousands of people descended on the farm where she was being raised. So White Buffalo Woman essentially gave them the tools for creating their society. The prayers, the rituals, the things like that that they would need going into the future. And when she was done, she circled the medicine lodge 4 times and smoked the peace pipe, apparently with a mixture of tobacco and willow bark.
Can't say that I've ever indulged
Well,
in willow bark.
it worked for them. And she said, "From now on, your nation and mine will be as one." And she walked outside and she changed into a white buffalo calf, because she had, of course, been a buffalo all along. And as she trotted away, suddenly they heard this like thunderous noise, and this huge like herd of countless buffalo went roaring past them. And the buffalo offered themselves to the Sioux as sacrifice to keep them alive. And when she said, like, your people and mine are one, what she was saying was that the Sioux and the buffalo were now the same, that they were all blood brothers.
Yeah.
This goes into a Native belief that the Native Americans seem to see themselves in a broad sense as being a part of an ongoing system.
Yeah.
Whereas a European point of view is that you're above the system, you're outside of nature. As the Native Americans always saw themselves as being a part of nature. So they revered the buffalo, but they also killed it. But if you kill it in the right way and have respect for it, it'll always come back and be there for you.
Right.
And the buffalo, of course, famously provided them with everything.
Yeah.
It provided them with tools, provided them with weapons, it provided them with clothes. They could build shelter out of it, and of course it fed them. Buffalo are good eating. It literally gave them everything that they needed, including the ability to make more pipes.
And soap.
Yeah.
Render down their fat.
Oh yeah, yeah. They use every part of the buffalo. And buffaloes, as they're traveling along on the plains, would like throw themselves to the ground and roll back and forth in the dirt to cleanse themselves off and scratch that itch they can't quite reach with their hooves. And when they did that, they would expose this red stone to the sky. And they saw that as the same type of thing that White Buffalo Woman's pipe was made out of. So they're able to pick up the stone and carve it and make it into new pipes for themselves. They would give these out as gifts to other tribes and so forth. And so those deposits of the red stone is also known as pipestone. It's sometimes called Catlinite, after George Catlin, the famous painter of the Sioux, who was the first person to actually record it.
I didn't realize there was a famous painter of the
Yes,
Sioux.
George Catlin, or Caitlin, I guess, Catlin. He painted them while they were still a functioning group of people.
What time frame was this?
1800s.
Wow.
And so, in many times, the only record of the way these people lived is these paintings that he left behind.
Are they still available?
Yes, you can look them up on the internet. They're really gorgeous paintings. He recorded their dress, the body art, and all that kinds of things. And again, the only record we have of some of these things is what he did of them. And he also reported back on this red stone that he'd never seen before. It's technically a type of clay. There were deposits found all across North America, some of them in different colors.
Mm-hmm.
There's a deposit in Canada that produces black stone
Mm-hmm.
of the same type. It's soft enough it can be carved with a knife. So it's very cool stuff. And to this day, the natives called it pipestone or redstone. There is a Pipestone National Monument in Minnesota, which is a place where they have the original deposit that the Sioux used to make their pipes out of. And today it's illegal for anyone who's not a native to come there and dig up the stone to preserve it.
Wow.
And they have a big festival every year where you can go and actually buy red stone pipes from people who are sometimes third and fourth generation pipe makers.
Wow.
So yes, that tradition is still going on to this day. White Buffalo Woman is a powerful figure. She's one of the very cool, native goddesses and so forth. Their relationship to the buffalo was a complicated one, like I said before. It provided them with everything, but they also, of course, depended on it. They killed it.
Right.
When the Spanish introduced horses to the Southwest, they had the ability to actually follow the buffalo and keep up with them, rather than constantly trying to catch up with the herds as they moved across the plains.
Right.
But in those days, there were so many buffalo, it was impossible to imagine them ever going away. So they were an infinite source of food and things like that. There's also a similar legend, not a similar legend, but an interesting parallel among the Omaha people. The Omaha have a story that a hunter was out hunting for buffalo, and he saw a lone buffalo standing there in the plain. So he hunched down the grass and he waited for it to move so he could follow it and find where the rest of the herd was. And the buffalo just stood there. And he stood there and he stood there. So time passed. The hunter fell asleep, woke up the next morning, and the buffalo was still there, completely unmoving, not eating, not drinking. So he thinks, this is pretty strange, even for a Native American story. So eventually, the buffalo trots away, and he walks over there and discovers that it was standing over a plant that he'd never seen before. And as we called the rest of his people over to take a look at it, it was a completely unknown plant to them. And so they waited, and after a few months, it grew taller and taller. It was almost as tall as a man. And it had this very big, thing sticking off the side of it. And so it was covered with, it had a tassel on the end of it that started out yellow and then turned brown. So they thought, well, we have to see what this is. So they broke it off the big stalk, and they peeled back the leaves and discovered maize, what we call corn.
Very cool.
And that was how corn arrived to their people. Other groups have a different story about a corn maiden whose story is extremely similar to the white buffalo one, and that she's a beautiful woman who arrives and gives them the gift of corn.
My dad was a fan, and he actually gifted me a white buffalo for some of its positive attributes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure which specific tribe or culture he was associating with, but yeah, I believe I still have it stored away.
Well, the Sioux stretch across the Great Plains with their 13 different tribal classifications, and that covers everything from the southern part of Canada all across Minnesota, the Dakotas naturally, all the way down into the Midwest. And so that legend is stretched across a huge piece of geography. You also find a lot of times that one myth will appear with several different people. I wanted to talk about Thunderbird. There aren't a lot of long stories about Thunderbird. They're all really short ones.
Mm-hmm.
But Thunderbird is something you find on the East Coast, in the Midwest, all the way in the West Coast. Thunderbird is a giant bird, a huge eagle, probably smaller than the eagle that rescued that woman, but still a gigantic eagle. And basically, he is the storm. He shoots lightning out of his eyes, and when he beats his wings, that makes thunder. He was a terrifying figure. He was usually seen as being a guardian protecting the people, but he also had a fierce temper, so if you angered him or broke some taboo, he would just incinerate you with a lightning bolt. And thinking about this, I realized that, like, if you're on the Great Plains, storms are terrifying.
Yeah.
For one thing, frequently you're the tallest thing in the area. So the Indians of the Plains had every reason to be fearful and respectful of Thunderbird. On the East Coast, they have a story that Thunderbird represents the sky, and he's in eternal battle against the underworld. They believe that there was a panther that breathed water, that lived under like the bodies of water in the earth, and that Thunderbird and the water panther were constantly at war. Back in the day, there were big cats all up and down the eastern seaboard.
Mm-hmm.
The Florida panther is the last one that hasn't been made extinct.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very sad. So they dealt with carnivorous, big cats, probably the size of like cougars,
Mm-hmm.
but still an impressive carnivore. And in other parts of the country, further towards the southwest, they believed that Thunderbird was an eternal war against an evil horned lizard. The myth of the horned lizard you also find in several different native tribes. Horned lizard described differently. Sometimes it's actually a snake with like ram's horns coming off of it, and they find artistic depictions of it. And sometimes it's shapeshifter that takes on human shape to infiltrate a tribe and do evil things.
Mm-hmm.
But Thunderbird was its arch enemy and would seek out the horned snake. The horned snake had several different names, Akatina being one of them, one of the ones I can pronounce easily.
Mm-hmm.
So they believed that it was at war against this shape-shifting, like evil horned serpent. One of the things that people have thought about is possibly the myth of the Thunderbird comes from finding fossils of dinosaurs. If they had found fossils of a pterodactyl, let's say, it was obviously a flying animal.
Right.
That was huge.
Yeah. I can see
As
that.
it took on mythological proportions. It's also entirely possible that finding the bones of something like a triceratops led to the myth of a horned lizard.
Right. Yeah. That would make sense.
So yes, so it all fits together like that. What do you think? Those are the Sioux, the Plains Indians.
It's very interesting. I love the idea of us being part of nature, not separate
Yeah.
from it. I would have to agree with that ideology.
I said last week that I don't consider myself nearly capable of talking about Native American philosophy or their worldview. It's very much outside of my purview. But reading those stories, it does remind you that they saw themselves as being part of an eternal cycle, not separate from it, looking at things. They were part of it.
Right.
They were part of a moving thing that was constantly in motion. Yeah.
Absolutely.
They lived close to the land because that was how they lived. And everything, the seasons, the weather, thunderstorms, the buffalo, and everything were all part of their world.
Cats on the East Coast.
Yep.
So I've always been intrigued with people who lived in accordance with, the natural land and lifestyle. So lots of interest, and definitely excited to hear more. What's
Yes,
up next?
we can move to the West Coast next. And I'm missing out on a lot of things because, as with all of my mythology, I'm skimming over a lot of stuff. I'm going to ignore the Seminole for a while. I'm going to ignore all the ones from the South and things like that, the Cherokee and so forth. I can do them, but I'm really anxious to get to the West Coast
Okay.
because that's the home of the two big trickster gods,
Oh.
Raven in the northwest and Coyote in the southwest.
Okay.
So we're back in familiar territory with more trickster gods next week.
Sounds great.
All right, until then, I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.